I had always been drawn to the idea of solitude, so when I found the small house on the edge of the woods, I thought it was perfect. It wasn't much, just a modest structure with creaky wooden floors and a faint musty smell, but it was mine. The landlord had mentioned that it was old, but structurally sound. I brushed off the warnings about its quirks. I wanted peace, and this place promised it. The first few hours were uneventful. I unpacked my essentials, set up my bed, and opened the windows to let in fresh air. By nightfall, the house was silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that makes you acutely aware of every creak and groan. Lying in bed, I tried to focus on the peacefulness, but the stillness pressed down on me like a heavy blanket. It wasn't long before I heard the sound. A faint scratching, almost imperceptible at first. My mind quickly provided rational explanations. Squirrels, perhaps, or the old wood settling. But as the minutes dragged on, the sound grew more distinct. It was coming from the ceiling. The noise wasn't constant. It stopped and started. A pattern that felt deliberate. A faint scrape, a pause, then a faint shuffle. I told myself it was nothing, rolled over, and tried to sleep. But the sound persisted, like a stubborn thought you couldn't shake. By midnight, it stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving me in restless silence. I convinced myself it was nothing serious, just the quirks of an old house. But when I woke the next morning, I noticed something odd. A fine layer of dust had settled on the floor near the corner of the room, directly beneath where I'd heard the sounds. Looking up, I noticed a faint crack in the ceiling that hadn't been there before. I brushed it off and decided not to dwell on it. Old houses make noise, I reminded myself. That's all it was. For now. The second night began much like the first, quiet, uneventful. I had spent the day convincing myself that the previous night's noises were harmless, just the house settling into its old frame. Still, I found myself glancing at the crack in the ceiling more than I cared to admit. By 10 p.m., I was in bed, reading under the dim glow of a bedside lamp. My eyes were heavy, and I was about to drift off when it started again. The sound was faint at first, a soft, scratching noise, like fingernails grazing wood. It came from the same spot, directly above me. I froze, straining to listen, my breath caught in my throat. This time, it didn't stop. The scratching grew louder, followed by a dragging noise, as though something heavy was being pulled across the wooden planks above. It wasn't random. It had rhythm, purpose. I lay there, paralyzed by the unease crawling up my spine. When the sound stopped abruptly, I dared to breathe again. But the silence didn't last. A new noise emerged, one that sent a cold wave of dread through me. A low, raspy exhale, like something breathing too close to the ceiling. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it toward the crack. It was still just a faint line in the wood, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was on the other side, pressing against it. The breathing stopped. For a moment, I felt relief, until I heard a faint, deliberate knock. Once. Twice. 3 times. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding, and bolted from the room. My hands trembled as I flicked on every light in the house. I paced the living room, convincing myself to go back upstairs and check. It's an animal, I thought. It has to be an animal. The courage to investigate didn't come that night. Instead, I sat in the living room until dawn, eyes fixed on the staircase, listening for any sign of movement. When daylight finally poured through the windows, I felt foolish. Armed with the light of morning and a broom for protection, I climbed the stairs to inspect the furrow. The crack in the ceiling was slightly wider than before. Dust and splinters littered the floor beneath it, but there was no sign of any creature. I pulled the cord to the attic hatch and climbed up carefully. The attic was empty, silent. There were no nests, no droppings, no signs of any life. But in the farthest corner of the room, the wooden planks bore deep scratches, like something had been clawing at them from above. I stared at those marks for far too long before backing away and closing the hatch. Whatever it was, I wasn't ready to face it. Not yet. I spent the day avoiding the bedroom. Every time I passed the door, my stomach churned with unease. The rational part of me insisted I was overreacting. Old houses creak. Animals scratch. That's all it was. But deep down, I knew better. By evening, I decided I couldn't let fear control me. Armed with a flashlight, I climbed back into the attic. If there was an animal up there, I would find it. The air in the attic was stifling, carrying the stale scent of dust and wood rot. The beam of my flashlight danced across the exposed beams and insulation, revealing cobwebs and forgotten debris. My heart pounded as I moved toward the far corner, the one where I'd seen the scratches. That's when I noticed it. The floorboards in that corner weren't just scratched. They were worn down, splintered in places, and wedged between the boards. Something glinted faintly in the flashlight's beam. I crouched down and pulled it free. A tiny shard of metal, twisted and sharp, like a fragment of a tool. I didn't have time to think about what it meant. Above me, a faint creak drew my attention to the ceiling. My flashlight jerked upward, illuminating the exposed rafters, and something moved. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw it clearly. A shadow, darker than the surrounding wood, shifting slowly, deliberately. It was pressed against the slanted ceiling of the attic, just out of reach of the light's full beam. My breath caught in my throat as I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The shadow seemed to ripple, like it was alive, before retreating into the farthest corner of the attic, disappearing into the darkness. I scrambled down the ladder, slammed the attic hatch shut, and locked it, as if that would keep whatever it was contained. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stumbled back into the living room, gasping for air. This wasn't an animal. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, every light in the house blazing, clutching my phone in one hand and the shard of metal in the other. When the sun finally rose, I made up my mind. I would leave. Whatever was in this house, it wasn't something I wanted to understand. But as I climbed the stairs to gather my belongings, I stopped short. The crack in the bedroom ceiling had widened significantly, a jagged line that stretched nearly the width of the room. And beneath it, on the floor, lay fresh splinters of wood. Leaving wasn't as simple as I thought. Every time I packed a bag, a wave of hesitation stopped me. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, like the house itself didn't want me to go. By nightfall, I decided I couldn't leave until I confronted whatever was up there. If I didn't, I knew it would follow me. I waited until the house was completely silent. Armed with a crowbar and my flashlight, I climbed back into the attic, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt heavier than before, thick with a faint metallic tang. The flashlight beam trembled in my hand as I swept it across the attic. At first, it was empty, just the same cobwebs and exposed beams. Then I saw it. In the farthest corner, where the shadows pooled unnaturally dark, it was waiting. The creature was hunched, its limbs impossibly long, its body twisted as though it had been folded and crammed into the space. Its skin was mottled and gray, stretching taut over jagged bones. But it was the face, or what should have been a face, that made my breath catch. It had no eyes, only deep hollows that seemed to absorb the light. Its mouth was too wide, filled with teeth that were sharp and uneven, like broken glass. And it was watching me, though I don't know how, without eyes. The creature didn't move. It just stared, its head cocked slightly, as though studying me. I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. My flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, I heard it move. A scraping sound, slow and deliberate. When the light came back on, it was closer. Its head tilted further, and for the first time, it made a sound. A low, guttural rasp, like a voice dragged through gravel. Leave. The word sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I swung the crowbar wildly, but the creature recoiled into the shadows, faster than I could react. The sound of splintering would fill the attic as it scrambled across the beams, circling me like a predator. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a loose board. I fell hard, the crowbar clattering out of my hand. The flashlight rolled away, its beam casting wild, erratic light across the attic. And then the creature lunged. I barely managed to grab the flashlight and shine it directly at the thing. It let out a screech, retreating into the far corner, its long limbs contorting unnaturally as it slipped back into the darkness. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I scrambled down the attic ladder, slammed the hatch shut, and dragged a heavy piece of furniture over it. For the rest of the night, I sat in the corner of the living room, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. The house was silent, but I knew it was still there, waiting. Morning brought little relief. The memory of that thing, its hollow gaze, the screech that still echoed in my ears, was enough to make my hands tremble. But what unsettled me most was the single, rasped word it had spoken. Leave. It wasn't a warning. It was a command. I spent the day pacing the house, debating what to do. Part of me wanted to obey, to pack my things and drive as far as I could. But another part, darker and more stubborn, couldn't let it go. Why was it here? What did it want? As the sun set, I realized that leaving wasn't an option. Not yet. Something inside me demanded answers. Armed with a hammer, my flashlight, and a lighter for good measure, I climbed the stairs to the bedroom one last time. The crack in the ceiling had widened further, a jagged wound in the wood. Dust and splinters covered the floor, and faint marks, long, thin scratches, lined the edges of the opening. I stood beneath it, staring up at the dark slit, my heart pounding. Whatever was in the attic, it was close. And this time, I wouldn't run. I grabbed a chair, dragged it beneath the crack, and climbed up. With trembling hands, I raised the hammer and began prying at the wood. The first plank splintered easily, revealing a narrow gap that reeked of decay. I hesitated, then pulled away another piece, widening the hole. That's when I saw them. Eyes, dozens of them, glowing faintly in the darkness. They blinked in unison, staring down at me from within the shadows. My breath hitched as I stumbled back, nearly toppling off the chair. The wood above groaned, and then, with a sudden, violent crack, the ceiling gave way. A mass of limbs and shadowy flesh tumbled through the opening, landing with a wet, heavy thud on the floor. The creature was larger than I'd imagined, its body a grotesque tangle of arms and legs that bent in unnatural directions. Its hollow face turned toward me, and it let out a sound, a low, guttural growl that vibrated in my chest. I backed away, clutching the hammer, but it didn't lunge. Instead, it dragged itself toward me, slow and deliberate, its jagged fingers clawing at the floor. And then it spoke again. Leave. The word was louder this time, more insistent, and the walls seemed to tremble with the sound. I gripped the hammer tighter, my mind racing. What do you want? I shouted, my voice breaking. The creature stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, it raised one long, bony finger and pointed toward the attic hatch. Leave, it repeated, its voice lower, almost pleading now. That's when I noticed the faint outline of something etched into the floor beneath it, a symbol, scratched deep into the wood. It looked ancient, intricate, and wrong. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. It's trapped here. I didn't wait to find out why. I bolted from the room, slamming the door behind me. The creature's rasping voice followed me down the stairs, growing fainter with each step. Leave. Leave. I didn't stop until I was in my car, the engine roaring to life. As I drove away, I glanced back at the house one last time. The bedroom window was dark, but I thought I saw something move, a faint shadow slipping back into the attic. I didn't stop driving until the house was miles behind me. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and my chest heaved with the effort to catch my breath. I told myself it was over, that I was free. But even as the highway stretched out before me, that word echoed in my mind. Leave. What was it warning me about? I found a motel on the edge of town and checked in for the night. The clerk barely looked up as I stumbled to my room, my legs shaking beneath me. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the bed. For the first time in days, I felt safe. Or so I thought. At around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of faint scratching. My heart sank as I sat up, my body cold with dread. The sound was coming from above, the ceiling. I stared at it, paralyzed, as the scratching grew louder, more deliberate. Then came the dragging noise, slow and heavy, followed by a familiar, raspy exhale. No, I whispered, shaking my head. No, no, no. The noise stopped abruptly, and for a moment, the room was silent. Then, from the far corner of the ceiling, I heard it, a low, guttural voice that made my stomach drop. Leave. I grabbed my keys and bolted from the room, not bothering to take my things. The night air was cold as I threw myself into my car and sped off, the motel shrinking in my rearview mirror. I didn't stop driving until the sun rose. By then, I was far from the house, far from the motel, far from anything familiar. But the fear never left me. Even now, as I write this, I can hear it. The faint scratching, the heavy dragging, the rasp of its breath. No matter where I go, no matter how far I run, it always finds me. And every time, it says the same thing. Leave.